In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a set of modular orc Junktown terrain like this out of literally junk. I'm Guy from Midwinter Minis, and I'm going to level with you. It's not just unpainted models. I have another pile of shame. These are sprues, the frames that the models I make and paint come on. You have to snip out the bits and then assemble them, but once you're done and you've removed any spare parts, you're left with these empty frames. Now, as you'll know if you've watched any of my videos, I'm a bit crafty, and the idea of throwing away all this rigid, easy to work with plastic just doesn't really sit right with me. Plus, can you even recycle this stuff? No. Best to hold on to it all, just in case you need it for some hobby project, right? Well, today is that day. Now, all sprues are not created equal, and the first thing I want to do with these piles is to sort them by usefulness. Sprues with big, empty, straight shapes are super useful because they're already rigid and make quite good construction bits. Sprues with these really tightly packed, curvy parts, not so much. Once I had the really useful sprues separated, I grabbed the tools I'd need to actually get building. You'll want some plastic glue, which melts the plastic together, forming a very strong bond over time. You'll also need some snips to actually cut the sprue apart, a couple of knives to shave off random bits, and some files to level things off. I just use cheap nail files for stuff like this. It's also useful to do this on a cutting mat that shows a unit of measurement. Now, the game systems I play use inches, so I use the imperial side of the mat, nice and quick for eyeballing sizes. The next step is to choose some useful, basic repeating shapes. Depending on what you want to make, the sections obviously don't all have to be the same size, but for my build I cut out 20 of these little rectangles. They're about 3 inches high and just over 4 inches wide, pretty good for the wall sections that I have in mind. They each have a small section in the corner which is missing, which will be no good for rigidity, but we'll deal with that in a minute. The next thing we want to do is to try to make these sit as flat as we can on the tabletop. I simply laid them on a nail file and rubbed them backwards and forwards while keeping the sprue shape as upright as I could. This doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to remove a bit of the bevel that the sprues will often have. Next up, I cleaned the sprue shapes by snipping off all the little gates that are used to connect the model parts. You can save the bits you snip off for making quick and easy rubble later if you like. Now let's fix the incomplete shape. Simply snip a straight bit off one of the not so useful sprues and bridge the gap. Plastic glue dries with a very strong bond, so no worry about it snapping over time. For my project, I just got into the zone and made 20 of these sections. I also had to put on a thick thermal glove because my snips started coming apart from hours of hardcore snipping, and they were really digging into my palm. Now those parts are ready, we need to pair them up and connect them. I use the outside edge of the useless busy sprues to clip out 2-inch sections. The first one I accurately measured and then used that as a guide for cutting out the rest. That way I knew they'd all be a reliably similar size. Now, using something perpendicular to the table to prop up the structures and keep them straight, well, straight enough for orcs, I glued the new brace sections to the frames. 4 pieces in total, 1 in each corner. After a couple of minutes, the plastic glue is solid enough to put them aside and work on the next one. Now, you'll be pleased to know that this was the trickiest bit of the build and it's out of the way. The next part is a lot more slapdash and fun. So fun in fact, Penny joined me for it. Basically, we want to create 2 floor levels, one on the bottom and one on the top. This is super easy to do, and we know the distance between the 2 sections is about 2 inches, so we simply cut out loads of sprue bits, plastic food packaging with cool texture, lolly sticks and coffee stirrers to bridge the gap, making sure there aren't too many big holes left that models could fall through. Well, unless you want it to be like that, of course. Now, because we'll want to cover one side of these structures with a wall, you'll want to make sure that there isn't any overhang on the bits that you just added for the floors. It doesn't really matter if there's overhang on one side, just so long as the other side is totally flat. If you've got any random pieces that overhang, just cut them off, and then lie the assembly flat on the table to make sure they don't rock around too much. In this way you'll know that the contact area is pretty much flat. Now it's time to create the junk metal walls, and to do this I'm going to be using cardboard from a box of cornflakes. This thin cardboard is an awesome terrain building material. It's easy to cut, easy to shape, easy to glue and paint, but it's often overlooked because it's not very strong and it's prone to getting a bit dog-eared over time. No problem for this build, because all of our structure is made of a strong plastic. This stuff is just for decoration. To create the rough shape of the wall, I use a pencil to trace the shape of the frame onto the card, using an orc model for height reference so I know how high I'd like the wall on the top to be, and then cutting it out using scissors. Again, it's just so easy to work with card. Dry fit it to make sure the wall sits flat against the frame and that it doesn't spill over the sides too much. Looking good. Now let's cut a window in a few of them. Using a model again to get the height that works, I cut out a rectangle from the center with a knife. Alright, this works. Now, because all of the frames I made are exactly the same size, this should work as a template for my other card walls, so I simply use it to trace onto the card and made 10 more. I kept 2 as full walls with no windows. Obviously you can do whatever you like if you decide to try this project yourself. Once all the card walls are ready, it's time to glue them. Now, after weighing up the options, I decided to use hot glue to fix the card to the frames. I always try to avoid using too many specialist tools in my videos, as I know not everyone has them, but honestly, this thing cost me a $5. It's pretty much the worst hot glue gun ever made, and it takes a million years to heat up, but it still gets the job done, eventually. The hot glue not only binds the 2 different materials together quite nicely, it also does a bit of gap filling too, so the connections don't have to be perfectly flush. After the glue is dried, if you've got any straggly, globby bits of glue hanging over the edges, cut it away using a sharp knife. Resist the temptation to pull it. You run the risk of just pulling all the glue away that might hold things together. Now let's make the walls look a bit more orky. I cut up the cereal box cardboard into thin strips like this, and then cut those strips into triangles. Now slop a bit of PVA onto the upper edge of your walls and around the windows, and randomly start sticking these triangles down. I'm doing this on the inside, so it frees up the outside for my next step. And the next step is basically the same thing, but making squares instead of triangles, and adding areas of random reinforcement and replacement panels, imagining that they're covering up damage or filling gaps. Give them a few hours to dry. PVA bonds really well over time, especially on paper and card, but it takes a while. Once you're happy they're nice and dry, it's time to prime. I gave all my pieces a couple of coats of cheap black spray paint, and now they're all one colour, you can kind of see that they're now a thing that you can actually use in a game or dioramas, rather than just bits of rubbish stuck together, which is what they basically are. Also, I couldn't get the black spray paint off my nail, no matter how hard I scrubbed. It's still on me as I edit this video days later. Now it's time for a super simple paint job. The first thing I want to do is make the plastic sprue parts look like metal. And this is easy enough to do with a quick dry brush. For terrain, I use this gummed up pot of lead belcher. I don't know what the hell's wrong with it, but yeah, well, it's pretty much only good for stuff like this these days. Get some on your brush, wipe a bit away on something absorbent like paper towel, and then sweep your brush back and forth. And this will catch the raised areas but leave the black in the recesses. Go fast and loose with this, it doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, the rougher the better. After you're happy with your metal look frames, it's time to paint the walls. Now, we don't want to go too heavy-handed with dry brushing for these sections, as you'll run the risk of fraying the sharp edges of the cardboard. Instead, we'll use soft sponging techniques to build up texture without damaging the material. Just tear up some packing sponge or kitchen sponge, maybe get some help from a friend. Now smush some grey paint around on your palette with a sponge and start dabbing it onto the card in a sort of random pattern. Change how you hold the sponge and rotate it so you don't make the same splodge pattern appear everywhere. You can already see that as the sponge can't reach into the recesses very well, it automatically creates this illusion of depth. Now add some white to make a lighter grey and continue the process, but pressing a little less and using a little bit less paint, so you'll still be able to see the black and grey underneath. Now don't worry if it looks a bit too stark at the moment, we're going to knock it down and grunge it up soon, but it's better to have a lot of contrast at this point. For the bits of lolly stick that look like wooden planks, we'll simply paint them with a khaki base coat. I'm using Citadel's Zandri Dust, it's one of my favourites, and it doesn't have to be the tidiest or most opaque base coat, you just don't want them being silver or black. Okay, so that's the base coats out of the way. Time for transfers. You can add them if you want, I had tons of these orc transfer sheets, so I just placed a few of the checker pattern strips randomly around the walls. Now let's get weathering. To give everything a corroded, worn look with pretty much zero effort, I over-dilute a deep gold paint, Gehenna's Gold by Citadel in this case, so that it starts to break apart. To make this happen, you need to use about 3 parts of water for each part of paint, and when you do this, the acrylic bond breaks down, and the pigment and alum particles that make it shiny start floating around in the water. For most purposes, this paint is now unusable, but for ultra-fast, cool weathering, it's perfect. Slop this all over the walls and then lay it down flat so the paint doesn't just drip downwards. And once it's dry, you can see that it's added this really cool, uneven, mottled corrosion effect. Considering it takes about 5 seconds to do on each wall panel, it's so effective. Next up, I'm using my DIY dip wash, which is basically a homemade shade paint with a bit of glue mixed in to paint all of the metal frame structures and floor parts. When this dries, the added glue will help things stand up to a bit more abuse during gameplay. You can also slap a bit on the walls too, which will add more layers of dirt and corrosion. It's best to leave that kind of really wet, messy step to dry overnight, as you don't want to try and touch that stuff too soon and get fingerprints all over it. In the morning, I dry brushed a bit of khaki paint back onto the wooden bits, classic modelling technique of painting wood to look like wood. And now finally, a totally optional stage. The slightly glossy finish of the dip wash and the diluted gold paint have given the walls a bit of a shine, and I don't want them glaring too much under my big battle report lights, so I hit them with a light spray of matte varnish, which helped keep the shine under control. And, well, that's it. Easy to make, simple to paint, and totally modular. I'll be able to use these as fortified walls, orky scaffolding on the outside of other buildings, or just pile them together into makeshift buildings on their own. They stack really nicely. You can obviously customize them however you like to suit your army, maybe with fewer spikes or, less windows, but making orc terrain is easy, and you don't have to be accurate. You can just cut and glue away and have fun. It's also a great project to get kids involved with too. The messier the paint job, the better. So this is obviously just one idea of how to use spare sprues in your hobby without simply throwing them away, but I'd love to hear your suggestions for what to make. Maybe I'll make a video on them in the future. Before we go, a huge thanks to our newest patrons: Cody Gibson, John O'Davies, David Nandrin, James Grimdark, Unaided Foot 3531, Bo Rilla, Bartoj, Nuka Cole, Tristan Frayling, Michael Strange, Reese, Matthew Sisler, Andrew Haas, James Gregory, Russ Williams, Noldro, Stainsby Kingsby, Glenn James, Swira PLA, JCD, Edward Wolfson, Luke, Kanoa Thames, Bartosz Budensky, Athalios, Alex Goodman, Brandon Yee, Confucius, Rowan Ennis Wraith, Jacob Barry, Taito, Bard, and Matthew Townsend. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it useful and it's given you a few ideas of how to level up your own terrain builds, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.